Audio on demand from Vision Christian Media.
Jesus said, "If you hold to my teachings, you are really my disciples. Then you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free."
Underlying any addiction and lust is a deep thirst which only God can satisfy. Through the prophet Jeremiah, God said that Israel's problems was that they traded him for their idols, and it had left them with an unsatisfied thirst. He said, "My people have committed two evils. They have forsaken me, the fountain of living waters, and hewn them cisterns, broken cisterns that can hold no water." And the tragedy is that people try to quench their inner thirst with everything but God. They believe that somehow their thirst will be satisfied by created things instead of by the Creator. Augustine said, "Thou hast made us for thyself, O Lord, and our hearts are restless until they find their rest in thee." In other words, we've been created with a God-shaped room, and only God can fill it. John Piper so succinctly summed up life's meaning and purpose when he wrote, "God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him."
This is Set Free with Ken Legg.
Welcome to Set Free with Ken Legg, and I'm Phil Edwards, and this week we're looking at the subject of addictive behaviour. And it's probably a good thing just to recap just a little on some of the things we've discussed already this week about the problem of addiction. Ken's described it as a compulsive or obsessive relationship to a substance, person, behaviour or a thing. And we looked at what makes addiction differ from a habit. Addiction is characterised by bondage, life domination and destruction. And when we come to the cause of addiction, Ken, you mentioned that it really is a coping mechanism for those who haven't learned how to deal with the emotional pain. The drug, for example, is where the addict might run to in order to find refuge. That's right, isn't it?
Yes. Anyone who hasn't learned to be emotionally connected is a candidate for addiction of one kind or another, be it drugs, alcohol, porn, being driven to achieve through work or ministry, etc. So those who minister to people with addictive behavioural problems would normally seek to remedy that lack of emotional connectedness. I believe that emotional disconnection needs to be put right in two directions, vertically and horizontally. In other words, with God and also on a human level.
Okay.
So you remember the parable Jesus told about the house that was swept clean. If it remains empty, then, the devils that were cast out will come back and, they bring all their mates, and the last state will be worse than the original state. Now, I believe that that's really a reference to the fact that, it's one thing to get free of addictive behavior or substances. But if we don't understand that those things are basically a substitute for something which only God can supply, then we'll, be in danger of running back to those things that we ran to before.
Is Jesus saying here when he talks about the house being swept clean and if it's left empty, that it should actually be an addiction to Jesus that is the thing that replaces the addiction that we've tossed out, if you like, we've swept out?
Yeah, and that's a sweet addiction. I mean, we were created for a relationship with Him, and if we don't have that, if that's void in our lives, then there's going to be a vacuum that we're going to be terribly aware of.
We're getting to the nitty-gritty, the roots of addiction here, and I guess if people turn to their drug like Israel turned to their idols, you read a lot about that in the Bible, as a coping mechanism for their emotional pain, and they're never really going to be satisfied, so they're going to keep coming back for another fix, and then the addictive nature of their drug kicks back in and so on, and that's really the kind of thing that Jesus was talking about when he said, the house, if it's swept clean and not something replacing that, it's just going to come back.
Yeah, I think the first step to recovery, Phil, is for the addict to take responsibility for their addiction and see it for what it is. It's not a disease. It's not a demon. It's not the result of some hereditary roots and, all the other things that we kind of look to. It's basically simply the way that we've chosen to deal with our negative emotions. In Romans chapter 1, we learn a very important thing concerning idolatry, and it's this. Whenever God's people turn away from Him to a substitute or an idol, then God gives them over to whatever they've chosen in the place of Him. The result of that is that they become sick of it. And of course they would, because any created thing is totally inadequate to replace God, who gives and sustains the life of every living being.
Why do people do that, though? If they got a chance to keep falling back on their drug and they end up in addiction or come to a loving, caring God who created them in the first place and knows exactly how they function and how to meet their greatest need, yet they choose their drug. Why?
Well, I believe that the reason so many reject God for an inadequate substitute is because they don't really know him. Mm-hmm. Now, what I mean by that, Phil, is that God has been so terribly misrepresented that people end up running from him rather than to him. Sad to say, every week from some pulpits across the world, images of God are being carved out in the minds of millions of people, but often those images are actually gross misrepresentations of what God is like. He's portrayed as legalistic, judgmental, vindictive, and so on and so on. And people go home from meetings believing in a God who is a figment of somebody else's imagination. Just because, for example, they've heard an angry preacher, they have come to believe in an angry God. And naturally, they want to run and hide from this God. That's why God forbade his people from making images, in the Old Testament. Because those images were supposed to represent him, but whatever image a person attempts to create, they're going to get it wrong. Nobody can carve out an image and say, this is exactly what God is like.
Well, a classic example there is, if I say, what does Jesus look like? Instantly, millions of people would say, he's this humble-looking, bearded guy with a glow around his head, wearing a long flowing gown and his arms outstretched,
Yeah.
Is that really what he looked like?
Yeah, and often
I doubt it.
Those pictures are, blonde hair and blue eyes.
Yeah, that's right. That's exactly right.
And of course they would know because they've seen, Anyway, getting back to that, I mean, that's a good point to pick up on, Phil, because Jesus is the true image of God. And, we don't know what he looks like physically or what he looked like physically when he was on earth. But we do know what he's like in character and nature. And so the reason God said don't make any image or any representation of God is because you're going to get it wrong. Eventually, I will send to you the true image of the living God. And that's why Jesus is called the image of the invisible God. He's the brightness and the exact representation, the book of Hebrews tells us, of what God is like. So if you want to know what God is like, then read the Gospels. If we want to know how to live the Christian life, sure, read the epistles. But if you want to know the truth about God and maybe even get your mind straightened out about what God is truly like, read the Gospels, because there, as you're looking at the beautiful life of Jesus, we're reminded this is what God is like. This is God manifest in the flesh.
Matthew, Mark, Luke and John, great books to read. You talked about the Old Testament before as far as an example of addiction goes, the idols that they had created, the nation of Israel. What about in the New Testament, though, in the Gospels themselves or the epistles?
Yeah, I think there are examples there as well. I mean, take, for example, the woman at the well, okay?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Now, we often refer to her as an immoral woman because she had many men in her life. She'd had been married, 5 times and so on. And no doubt she was immoral, but that wasn't actually her problem. That's not the problem that Jesus addressed. In fact, he spoke of her as being thirsty rather than immoral. And her thirst, her addiction led to her sinful behavior and lifestyle. But she was a very thirsty woman. She was trying to find in relationship that which only God can offer. And I think that's the reason why a lot of people get into addictive problems, is that they're trying to find in those things, those behavioral patterns or those substances, something which really only God can give. And, he said to her, look, if you drink this water, you'll keep coming back. You'll always be thirsty. But if you drink the water that I give, you will never thirst again. And, of course, he was speaking about that spiritual water, which he can give to all of us that are thirsty.
And really, that's the ultimate answer, isn't it? For any of the struggles that we might have, the addictions that we might have, the temptations that we have, is to drink of that water of Christ.
Yes, I mean, there are many pleasures in life, but sometimes we look in those pleasures for things which only God can supply. Yeah. And we get disappointed and we want more and more, and we end up, going into overdose on those things. But Jesus said, if you come to me, I will give you living water and you will never thirst again.
We hope this discussion on addictive behaviour has been helpful for you today, and we'll have more tomorrow. Until then, remember, you don't have to carry that baggage. God wants you to be set free.
Find articles and more set-free podcasts in the free Vision Christian Media app or at vision.org.au.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.